like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
No, really. What is it? The iconic guiding question from the Scream movies is one that does demand answering. What is it that scares you? What can keep you engaged in a so-called scary movie? For me, I didn't really like horror movies until pretty recently. I found a lot of them to be repetitive and predictable, and it wasn't until a couple years ago that I found the appeal of the genre. But now, I've grown a fondness for them and found some that I like watching over and over again. One of those is the first Scream movie. But here's the thing, I've only ever seen the first Scream movie. Like other horror franchises, I kind of assumed that the first one was the only good one, and the rest of them were, bad. But this year, I learned that that was not the popular opinion. Most people consider the Scream franchise to be one of the few that is watchable the whole way through. So for Halloween this year, I thought it'd be fun to clean up those Scream movies, watch the few ones I hadn't seen yet, and briefly go into my thoughts on each of them and what I think makes each movie and the franchise as a whole work. Briefly, I'm not going to go into too much detail like I did with those green fucks. So here's your spoiler warning for every Scream movie. I'm going to talk about who Ghostface is in every single one, so if you don't want to know any of that information, now's the time to leave. To start things off, I feel the need to explain why the first Scream movie is one of my favorite horror movies. It's not that it's specifically scary or anything like that. Wes Craven clearly has a love for the genre, though, and infused a lot of that stuff into the first Scream movie. He's able to poke fun at the movies and dissect them by making fun of them a little bit, while still making an effective slasher movie in and of itself. It manages to be a spoof of the genre without being a spoof movie. I actually like the characters of Sidney, Gale, Tatum, and Dewey in the first movie, and the twist of Stu and Billy being Ghostface kind of caught me off guard the first time. Not to mention the whole idea of Ghostface being an anonymous person really gives the sequels a lot to work with every time and gives like this really fun formula like Scooby-Doo where each movie just gets to be a whodunit. And even though the movie does a lot to poke fun at other common tropes from horror movies, it still has a lot of iconography of its own, such as like the phone calls and Ghostface himself. And I think one of the less obvious things that the first Scream movie does is make Ghostface into just kind of a silly little guy. He's more threatening because he's like a normal guy you can just kick over or make him slip on a banana peel. Whereas Jason and Michael Myers, they feel so invincible that at a point they become less threatening because it's so expected when they're going to survive something. In a world where most slasher killers can't really be killed, it's nice to see a killer like Ghostface who probably can't even see through the mask. The only really unattainable feat that Ghostface ever pulls in any of the movies is that he's able to disappear behind moving vans like James Franco in Spider-Man 3, but besides that, he remains pretty grounded and constantly feels like he's on the same level as Sidney and Gale. And even though Ghostface does pull the goofy feats like disappearing every once in a while, it feels okay. Because while it is critiquing horror movies, it's still trying to be one. So not everything should be limited to the rules of the franchise in which it exists in. Not much more to say about the first Scream movie that hasn't already been said. It's funny, it keeps you guessing, and it still has some brutal kills like Tatum getting smushed in the garage door. If you haven't seen it and you call yourself a horror fan, I don't know what you're doing. It's really good. Now Scream 2. The horror movie sequel formula would typically include a scarier, more menacing Ghostface for the second movie, but since this is a Scream movie, we don't get that. The movie opens in a way to immediately deflect criticisms that people may have had of the first movie by introducing the meta-commentary device of the Stab movies. This is a really fun way to kind of poke fun at stuff that they had done in their own movie, now that they're not simply making fun of other horror movies, they're also making fun of their own Scream movies. Introducing the Stab movies also in this installment and in later installments of the series gives another angle for the characters to kind of bounce their theories off of, because it's not just how can we base what's happening off of the killings that are happening, but also how can we base what's happening off of how those killings were portrayed in the Stab movie. With all of her friends dead, the movie obviously has to give us a new cast, and college becomes the quickest and easiest way to do that. With the Stab movies introduced now too, we get to have Sidney in a new role as she transitions into being in the public eye.
She was in the public eye in the first movie too.
Because of her mom?
Yeah, she's being interviewed by Gale and she's in jail already pretty publicly.
Alright. as Sydney transitions to being even more in the public eye than she was in the first movie. So, Scream 2. Is it good? Surprisingly, yes. It's probably a bit towards the bottom of the pile in terms of the Scream franchise, but none of that is necessarily this movie's fault, and I think it's just things that other movies later on did better. But I think what makes this movie one of the weaker ones in my opinion is that it really does feel like one of the more formulaic Scream movies, and that's more so a criticism that's come now that we have 6 of them, not necessarily one that would come if this was the only other Scream movie. The red herrings of Cotton and the boyfriend being Ghostface is kind of predictable, and I never really bought it for a second, and the reveal that it is Mickey who is Ghostface was also kind of lame. But I did think the reveal that Billy's mom is the new Ghostface was a cool one. But while it is cool, I did also predict that one going in. It's not one that I would say shook me to my core. It is a fun Scream movie, as they all are, but not a particularly memorable one, in my opinion. But what I will say is that the opening of this movie is probably one of my favorites in the entire franchise. The idea of being in a theater of people dressed as Ghostface while getting killed by Ghostface so no one could tell, it's pretty freaky. Even scarier is the way the people were acting in that theater before the killings even began. Anywho, it's okay, but now it's time for Scream. I'm gonna be honest, I do not remember what happened in Scream 3. Hold on. Yeah, okay, now I remember. Yeah, this one's a bit of a whiff. The problem with Scream 3, in my opinion, is that it kind of forgets to be a horror movie. It's so focused on doing the whole meta thing that the other two became so popular for, that there isn't anything that I was actually scared of, or even that felt like a horror movie to me. I can't think of a particularly memorable sequence from the entire movie besides the scene where Sydney gets to enter a set of her own house, which I thought was pretty cool. But besides that, I don't think the movie really plays with some of the things that it could play with in any meaningful way. The movie talks a big game about how the third movie changes everything, and that like once you're in the trilogy, you never know who's gonna live and who's gonna die. But I never thought for a second that Sydney or Dewey or Gale was ever in any real danger. They keep talking about how there's a big reveal coming and no one's gonna see it coming, and it changes everything in the third movie all the time. And the reveal in this is that Sydney has a brother, and the brother is Ghostface, and I never really got the impression that Sydney cared that much. I don't really remember her saying anything about it or really being that shocked to begin with. On paper, I think it's a good idea because the whole franchise so far has been based off of Sydney and her kind of image of her mother that she's made in her head, and now finding out that that's kind of a false image should be a little more devastating than it actually is. And I don't even think he comes up in any of the sequels, so I don't think the Ghostface reveal was really that interesting. Plus, he's the only single Ghostface, which I think they also could have played with a little more, and we kind of maybe could have seen why that is. Instead, there's nothing really said about it. It is nice to see Sydney be able to hold her own and just kind of transfer into being like a full-on action hero. At this point, she kind of knows how this whole thing works and can just hold her own against Ghostface. Once again, the movies are still fun, very enjoyable. Despite me thinking this is the weakest Scream movie, I enjoy all these characters a lot, and it'll never not make me laugh to see Ghostface fall over a piece of furniture or whatever. So yeah, this one's not the strongest one, but even if the franchise stopped here, it would probably be a more consistently good horror series than pretty much any other one. But fret not, because 11 years later we did get God, the filmmakers must have been so fucking excited to put that 4 in the logo. This movie definitely has the funniest opening of all the Scream movies. We're getting a bunch of false openings that follow the identical structure of the first movie, except with Rogue from X-Men, which lulls us into being like, oh, here we go again. Same old predictable Scream movie, only for it to be revealed that it's all fake and they're actually stab movies. I think this one gets back to what made the first Scream movie pretty special, being that it has a good balance of meta commentary and actual horror. This one tackles the anatomy of reboots, following pretty much the closest structurally to the original, and the plot revolving around Ghostface making a reboot of his own. What I liked about this one in comparison to 2 and 3 is that it had some more brutal kills, and while I could have predicted Jill being Ghostface, the third Culkin brother being the other one did manage to catch me off guard, and I genuinely didn't see it coming because it was so obvious. Other Scream movies have used the most obvious character being Ghostface before, but I find it to be the most effective in this one. The movie doesn't end at the party, which I like. We actually get to go to the hospital with Sydney and watch her turn Jill's head into a grilled cheese, which is very iconic of her. I think Jill would honestly probably be my pick for one of the best ghost faces in the series. Her connection to Sydney helped with the whole not feeling like too obvious of a twist thing, and I think she gives the impression that she is the most unhinged ghost face in the entire series. I think this is a good Scream sequel with some of my favorite moments from the series, without being too heavy-handed on the meta commentary, which I think sinks some of the previous ones.
Clear.
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 Scream 5, just called Scream, is definitely the Force Awakens of the series. In that, it's pretty much an all-new cast, with the older characters only returning in mentor, Han Solo types of roles. While Scream 4 was talking a lot about reboots, this is the one that's actually a soft reboot of the series, or in the movie's weird terms that no one uses, requel. This one uses a lot of the Scream iconography to its advantage to criticize modern day reboots and the weird toxic culture that can surround them. With some not so subtle jabs at annoying Star Wars fans, the movie follows a very familiar structure to modern reboots, but for the first time in the series, changes something up. So far, the Scream movies have been the Sydney show, with Gale and Dewey being in the background as our secondary protagonists. And while Sydney does have a relationship to Gale and Dewey, it doesn't always matter that much. She has always been the loner who has to survive on her own, and her relationship with Gale and Dewey is more so out of necessity than it is out of a genuine connection between the three, at least at first. In this one, this is the first time we get to see a character and their relationship with another character explored directly through the film. Our new lead, Sam, struggles to bond with her sister, Jenna Ortega, whose name is Tara, who was attacked at the beginning of this movie. While the Scream movies have always been meta, they are at their core slashers, and this one gets back into that territory, even more so than Scream 4, which I said was already going back into that territory. This one pivots a lot more into what modern horror movies do, exploring trauma or societal problems through the use of horror. Yes, horror movies did always explore those things, but I think it's a lot more overt in the modern horror movies we get, like Midsommar, The Witch, or It Follows. They even foreshadow this by having Jenna Ortega say that those are some of her favorite horror movies. So we have a new modern angle, a new modern cast, but we still get to see our older characters return. They poke fun at the types of cliches that we see with this kind of thing, with Dewey being given the exact Han Solo treatment. He is pretty much just here to die, and he doesn't really get to do anything cool or triumphant, he just dies. I think that's a fun way to do it, rather than having him go out in blaze of glory or something stupid like that. But when it comes to Ghostface, I will admit that it's a very predictable twist, but it works really well because Jack Quaid is just so likable. But not just him, Mikey Madison, who plays the other character, whose name is Alice or Amber? I think it's Amber. The boyfriend and the friend of the group, pretty much the same Ghostface situation as the first movie, makes its way back, but still manages to kind of catch you off guard. I think what makes those twists more satisfying in Scream 5 is that the writers kind of understood why those work about the first Scream movie. Because Jack Quaid is so likable, you want to believe it's not him, which may not surprise you that it is him. It does make you have a more emotional reaction to that reveal. The slow reveal that we're in the house from the first movie also really managed to catch me off guard. I think that was a fun way to bring us back to a location that's familiar, and poke fun at how every soft reboot does the exact same thing. I think this movie as a whole uses the history of the franchise the most strategically and the most effectively. The new cast is great, and the fact that so many of them get to come back for 6 kind of presents a new formula for the series. Scream formula was getting a bit stale, but now things seem a little bit more shaky and unpredictable. Ghostface Takes Manhattan gives us the one thing that the series has sorely been missing so far. We actually get to leave Woodsboro. Right off the bat, the movie changes things around by giving us a Ghostface reveal right off the bat. And while he doesn't end up being Ghostface for the entire movie, it does lead to this very eerie sequence where after he kills someone, he takes the mask off and walks right past our new lead. But it still starts off with a phone call sequence like all the other ones pretty much, and we get to see who we think is going to be Ghostface for the entire movie get killed, which was another pretty strong way, I thought, subverting our expectations going in. This one easily has some of my favorite sequences from the newer ones, especially the scene with Ghostface in the subway, and the escape from the apartment on that shaky ladder, which both had me feeling really tense. Like the last one, this movie goes a bit deeper into the relationship between Tara and Sam, now dealing with the fallout and jump into fame that they have from the events of Scream 5. Now in New York, we get to follow our characters in a new environment, but still being followed by Ghostface. It looks like a lot of fans consider this to be the strongest Scream sequel, and while I mostly agree, I think if there is one thing that drags it down from being as strong as some of the previous ones, and that would be the Ghostface reveal. It's not that the cop being Ghostface was necessarily unsatisfying, but it's Spider from Avatar being Ghostface who's unsatisfying. He was such an obvious red herring, and the movie constantly tells us how obvious of a red herring he was, that when he did end up being it, I was kind of like, okay. I just don't think he even needed to be Ghostface. We had enough of a twist going on with the cop and his daughter, who was killed previously, who turned out to actually be alive. If it was just the dad and the daughter, the same result would have been achieved, so I just don't see why he even needed to be Ghostface at all. Aside from that though, setting the final battle in like a museum dedicated to Ghostface and all the Woodsboro murders was a really fun way to tie in the history of the series and just give us a fun location to be in. I think it's cool that we get a moment of the Ghostface begging for mercy from the sisters, and them just both looking at each other and being like, nah, fuck that. It was really cool, and I felt like it was very spiritually in line with the first Scream movie. This is also the first one that doesn't have Sidney Prescott, and while I do like that character a lot, I didn't necessarily miss her in this one. Plus we still had Courtney Cox, so there is still kind of a through line with all the characters, but I think it's refreshing that not every movie has to have every single character in it. So, while it may not be my favorite Scream sequel, mostly because of a Ghostface twist, I do think it's definitely one of the stronger ones, and probably at least in my top 3, and it did manage to rejuvenate a lot of my interest in the series when it was beginning to feel a bit stale and formulaic. I will happily go see Scream 7 and 8 when they come out, because I think these movies are just so much fun. So there it is, all Scream movies, and what I think works and doesn't work about all of them. I think the franchise just works so well because of its hook. Each movie being a whodunit, where we don't know who Ghostface is, prevents us from getting too familiar with the plot and feeling like the main threat isn't much of a threat. This is the problem with a lot of franchises like Halloween and Friday the 13th, is by the end, you're not really scared of Michael Myers anymore. He was scariest in the first movie. Ghostface being different every time, it means that he's not really the same person every time, so you don't know what to expect out of him. Despite the Scream movies having their own set of rules that they seem to never break, I don't think it's out of the question to see Gale or Sidney or any of our other main characters become a Ghostface at some point. But they never push it too far. Ghostface isn't supernatural, he never travels back in time, he's always just a guy in a Halloween costume. So, happy Halloween! Or late Halloween, depending on how fast I edit this. I'd be curious to know what you guys might think is the best horror series if it's not the Scream movies, because I think next Halloween, if I'm still doing YouTube videos, I would love to dive in to another ridiculously long series and see what works and doesn't work about all of those. So if you like this, and you'd be interested in hearing more of my horrifying movie takes, be sure to stay tuned for more stuff like this.
What's up?